The following program is an original production of WICC PBS Chicago.
In Cook County, jail time grows longer and longer for those awaiting trial. The system for posting bond, critics say, is in chaos, and the deck is stacked against the poorest suspects, crowding into a jail that costs taxpayers $300 million a year. Tonight, a special edition of In the Loop, Justice on Trial in Cook County. Good evening, I'm Chris Bury. When it comes to crime and punishment, the competing pressures are intense. Police are under pressure to clean up violent neighborhoods, prosecutors to charge suspected criminals, and judges not to appear soft on crime. The result is an overloaded system that funnels the poorest suspects into the Cook County Jail, where they will spend weeks, months, even years awaiting trial for charges that are very often dismissed. A system that Cook County Board President Tony Preckwinkle once called medieval. The question tonight, how do we fix it?
July the 6th, 2011, never forget it.
That is the day 59-year-old Darnell Martin, a maintenance worker for local contractors, walked into the Cook County Jail. The charge, felony theft. Bond was set at $50,000.
How do them judges come up with the amount that they charge these people with, man? It's crazy. They seem like they don't even, they just look at you and give you a number out the sky.
Martin spent more than a year in jail awaiting trial because he could not afford to pay the bail amount. He said life behind bars was sometimes unbearable and the food awful.
I stay up all night waiting on that boiled egg and a little thing of cereal. I was that hungry.
Martin is among thousands of suspects charged each year in Cook County. Like him, many are forced to sit in jail waiting for their trial dates because they cannot afford to post bond. And the wait times are getting longer. According to a Loyola University study, the average stay in Cook County Jail has climbed from 48 days in 2007 to 57 days in 2012.
Well, that surprises me because it's so low.
William Murphy has worked as a defense attorney in Cook County for nearly 48 years. He says it's not uncommon for people to sit in jail for a year or more awaiting trial.
It's so overcrowded, you can't get a speedy trial.
When suspects are arrested in Cook County, they are often taken to the criminal courts building at 26th and California, in an area behind the bond court called the Bullpen.
You can't believe it unless you've been back there. They're like stacked like animals, actually, and you can't get to them.
Attorneys and public defenders get to interview their clients for just a few seconds. Then a bond court judge hears the case and sets bond, a process that usually takes less than a minute.
At banquet, they never really get the full story. It just goes so fast.
Judges have total discretion when it comes to setting bond, which can be anywhere from a few $1,000s to millions. Those accused of crimes are required to post 10% of the bond amount to bail out of jail. Even that can be too much for many defendants, many of them poor blacks and Latinos.
If you looked at our jail, you wouldn't think there were any white people who lived in Cook County.
County Board President Tony Preckwinkle says the bond court inevitably sends poor suspects off to jail, while those with money can afford to await trial at home.
The problem we have is that we've based our criminal justice system on a cash bond, which means that it discriminates against the poor.
Preckwinkle has made criminal justice reform a focus of her administration. She points out that 70% of those awaiting trial in jail are nonviolent offenders who simply can't afford to make bail.
So we're trying to figure out alternatives to detention that reduce the population of people accused, not convicted, people accused of nonviolent crimes in our jail.
Those alternatives include electronic monitoring. Sheriff Tom Dart favors that approach.
I think 3 years ago at this time, I had, 0 people on electronic monitoring. Now the judges have been so engaged that I have almost 1,800 people on electronic monitoring today.
But some critics argue that releasing even nonviolent offenders back into the community is risky.
Well, we'll have to file a grievance for that.
Dennis Andrews is a retired corrections officer who spent 30 years working at the Cook County Jail.
We've had people out on I-bonds, we've had people out on electronic monitoring that ended up actually killing somebody.
Andrews now works for the union representing corrections officers.
Public likes for criminals to be locked behind the bars, safe and secure behind those walls.
Sheriff Dart, aware of these competing pressures, says the county needs a comprehensive approach.
We have to make sure that the people that are there because they're either a danger to the community or clearly they won't show up for court.
But with all the political pressure to reduce crime, reforming bond court in Cook County has rarely been a high priority, even if the prisoners who shuffle through the county jail have to wait weeks and months and even years for their constitutional right to a fair trial.
Is justice being served? I think there's a lot of people out there who really try, but there's a lot of people who are afraid to do the right thing.
Today we are joined by John Fritchie, Cook County Commissioner for the 12th District, Ali Abid, Policy Analyst for the Chicago Appleseed Fund for Justice, and Professor Randolph Stone, Director of the Criminal Justice and Juvenile Justice Project at the University of Chicago. Welcome, everybody.
Thank you, Chris.
Thank you.
John, you've spent time as an observer in bond court. Give us a very quick sketch of what it's like.
Well, a quick sketch is all it takes. The average bond hearing, when I would sit in there to watch the proceedings, is under 30 seconds, literally. And those 30 seconds can have a lifelong impact on who that defendant is. You heard statements before about keeping criminals behind bars. We're keeping people that are not criminals. They're charged with crime, but they're innocent until proven guilty. Yet the vast majority of people in Cook County Jail are detainees, not inmates. They're awaiting adjudication of their charges.
Ali, Assembly Line Justice here?
Absolutely. So Commissioner Fritchie is absolutely right. 93% of the population of the Cook County Jail are people awaiting their trial. And the bond court has become a system which is mostly based on cash bond systems. So the role that it's supposed to provide, that in judging whether somebody's actual risk to public safety or a flight risk, has been completely shifted over to a financial system that happens at 30 seconds at a time.
And on that note, Professor, is there any question but that cash system discriminates against people who don't have money?
No question about it. I mean, if you can afford to get out, you get out. If you can't afford it, you don't. It's a strictly monetary basis that determines whether or not a person is in jail or out of jail. People charged with the same crime, mind you. Those that can afford to pay the bond are on the streets. Those who can't afford it are locked up.
And how arbitrary is the bond amount set by the judges?
Well, I think it depends on the judge, but most judges tend to set bond a little higher than is necessary. As was pointed out earlier, some judges are concerned that if a person is released, what happens when they're out on bond? And so they tend to set bonds, I think, at a much higher amount than is appropriate.
It is.
Well, and the professor's right. Every judge is afraid of being the proverbial Willie Horton judge and having somebody reoffend while they're out, but they're looking at the wrong tests. We have people sitting behind bars, not because they're a flight risk or a risk to society, because they're poor. But in the meantime, about 40% of people charged with unlawful use of a weapon are bonding out because they have access to cash. So the people we're putting on the street aren't necessarily the low-risk ones, they're the ones with access to money.
And just to be clear, as those of you have said, the great majority of people in Cook County Jail have not been convicted of any crime, and on that point, Cook County Board President Tony Preckwinkle is adamant.
7% of the people in our jail are serving a sentence. That means that 93% of them are awaiting trial. 93%. And of those who are awaiting trial, 70% are awaiting trial for nonviolent crimes.
The other point that President Preckwinkle makes is when you look at the racial composition of the jail, the numbers are pretty startling. 67% of the prisoners are African American, 20% Latino, only 13% Caucasian. Professor, what does that tell you?
Well, until you actually see it, it's really hard to believe. But when you go back in the lockup as a lawyer, as I have done on many occasions, you're just blown away by the people of color that are locked up in our jail and prison system. And it says a lot about us as a society in terms of how we decide to mete out justice. And it's pretty clear that if you're poor and a person of color, the quality of justice that you receive is very low. You're locked up and caged, as one of the commentators pointed out, like animals, because they're just packed in there. It's a very startling and depressing sight.
Ali, is that a matter of race or economics?
It's largely a matter of both, but principally economics when it comes to the bond system. It's important to compare ourselves to other jurisdictions. In the Cook County bond system, a majority of people get put on monetary bonds. They get offered cash bonds that if they can pay them, they can get out. You look at large urban jurisdictions throughout the country, that's not the case. 14% of people in Kings County, New York, which covers Brooklyn and parts of New York City. That's all. That's all the amount of cash bonds happening there. And that's typical for large urban jurisdictions. Other places more in line with best practices, such as Washington, D.C., throughout Maryland, they have almost completely gotten rid of cash bonds, and they have rates of appearance that are the same, if not better, than Cook County.
Of those 70% that Commissioner Preckwinkle talked about being in jail for nonviolent crimes, I understand, Commissioner, that most of those are for drug crimes.
A lot of those are for low-level drug offenses, which is why I've been saying for some time we really need to revisit not just how bond court works, but the offenses that are putting people in front of a judge to start with. Doesn't make sense for us to pick somebody up off the street on low-level possession of marijuana, have them wind up getting a cash bond they can't afford, and now we're going to have them sit behind bars, not to mention the cost of us housing them at $143 a day is more expensive to taxpayers than almost any other option that would be a better option, whether it's day reporting, electronic monitoring, drug counseling, mental health screening. Any of these options are things we should be pursuing, would save us money, would have better outcomes. Almost every other large jurisdiction in the country understands that than Cook County. There's nothing different about Cook County defendants. There's nothing different about our court system other than it's not working right.
Right. And it's important to look at how these low-level charges are being treated and why it's important to have bond court be a real level of review. For example, every year in Cook County, 5,000 nonviolent drug offenders who get charged get held in the jail for an average of 25 days only to have their cases dismissed at their preliminary hearings for lack of probable cause. That's 25 days in jail for 5,000 people. That's 47% of all our nonviolent drug charges do not have probable cause when they get to that preliminary hearing stage.
Does that tell you that there's a big disconnect between police and prosecutors and judges?
Absolutely. And one of the major things that's happened is that over this last year, as the Illinois Supreme Court has done a thorough review and investigation of the pretrial system in Cook County, and one of the major faults they found was there was no information sharing going on. There was no coordinated assessment process happening between the stakeholders.
And that's part of what we need to change. Again, not only do we have a moral crisis in how we handle bond court, it's an economic one too. We're spending somewhere between $25 and $40 million a year to house people at Cook County Jail for charges that are ultimately dropped, not even just found not guilty. Charges are straight out dropped, yet we're spending tens of millions of dollars that could be going into other programs to house these people. Again, it's not really a criminal justice issue. It's a civil rights issue that we're looking at now when you do look at the percentage of people in there that are of color. I've been back in the bullpen as a professor has, and you go back there, it's a tough analogy to use and a hard analogy to use. It looks like a slave ship back there. You are looking at people in a cage. You'll see 80, 90 men in a cage. Maybe you'll see a few white guys. But other than that, it's young men of color that are being discarded by society, and we're creating a cycle that's only getting worse.
And in fairness, not everybody in Cook County Jail is a nonviolent offender. You have several thousand in there who have been accused of violent crimes, including murder and rape. Yes. Right now in federal court, there's a lawsuit going on about that, painting dramatically different portraits. A federal monitor is saying the judge is in substantial compliance, and the lawyers for the prisoners are saying that there's a culture of sadism and violence. Professor, as ordinary citizens reading these stories, what are we to make of these dramatically different pictures?
Well, as our commentators have pointed out, it's a systemic problem. It's not, and it's a complicated problem. And it's not going to be easy to turn around, but there are other jurisdictions where we can see best practices. So all the players and all the actors involved in this system have to begin to work together. Judges need to be a little more courageous about making bond a function of what it's supposed to be, ensuring that somebody returns to court, and lowering those amounts when it's necessary. Public defenders, who represent the majority of the people who come into the criminal justice system, need to be more aggressive about forcing judges to set reasonable bonds, low bonds, high bonds, and appealing those decisions when those bonds are set too high. Prosecutors need to be more trained better and focused more on asking for bonds only for violent offenders and not asking for high bonds for nonviolent offenders. So all the actors in the system have to have some leadership, some courage, work together towards solving this problem. It's easy to point fingers at different players and actors, but everybody, I think, has a responsibility. And it's for the rest of society that this is so important. It's not just for the people that are locked up, but it's for the rest of us out here. We want a system that works, we want a system that provides safety for us, and we want a system that's fair. Because if the system is not fair, if people don't have trust and faith in the criminal justice system, bad things happen,
What
as
about
we all know.
these charges of violence? And Sheriff Dart has said that it's a fictitious novel. What do you make of this? Ali?
Well, there are many violent offenders in the jail. People who are there for current violent charges and people who are there and being kept in there because their criminal history has violence in it. However, when you have a system that relies on cash bonds so much, the reason someone's in or out of the jail isn't because of what their risk to public safety is, it's because of their access to cash. When we have situations where, profiled in a recent Chicago Reader article, when somebody has access to cash and can put up $6,000 and was arrested for fighting with the police, they're out on the street. Whereas somebody who can't get access to $2,500 cash is still in the jail because he shoplifted $8 worth of soap from the Lakeview Walmart. So that's the sorting mechanism we're using. We're not using public safety, though it is quite true that there are many people who are in there for violent crime.
Commissioner, what do you believe when you hear these really different accounts of what goes on in the most maximum security part of the jail?
Well, listen, jail's not a fun place to be wherever you are in the jail. Are there problems within the jail? There's problems within any jail. The bigger issue, though, is can we alleviate those problems by not having overcrowding? We were at a point now where we were actually over the maximum. We had a federal judge close to ordering us to build a new prison. When you want to talk about a misallocation of resources, rather than fixing the system, talk about having to build more prisons. If we're in a society where prison construction is economic development, we've lost our way. So the issue, as I said, isn't what happens behind bars. Are we keeping too many people behind bars? Now, we've reduced the count from maybe 10,000 a day to maybe about 8,800 a day. So it's a step in the right direction, but not if half of those 8,800 shouldn't be there either. And so again, when you have people that are coming from a bad situation to start with, being put into an even worse situation, we're really teaching the best education that they're getting isn't in our Chicago public school system for some of them. It's in Cook County Jail, and what they're learning is to become career criminals.
And at the same time, there is a political argument out there, which we heard in the setup piece from the former corrections officer, who says the public wants these people locked up.
The public, I apologize, the public does not have a sincere interest in keeping a senior citizen who stole 6 bars of soap locked up while the gangbanger with a history of gun offenses is out on the street because he had access to money. The tools are out there for judges and prosecutors and defense lawyers alike to make a determination that is scientifically based on whether somebody should be released awaiting their trial or behind bars.
And this raises the question of why ordinary citizens who are watching this program tonight should care. The political question is very persistent in this county, and the defense attorney, William Murphy, has a pretty good answer for that.
You got to care about the people that are in jail because most of them are going to get out. And if they don't get some sort of help or get a job or occupation or some ties, they're going to be back again.
Let's talk about some specific reforms. Professor, what do you think the most single effective reform for the jail system, the bond system, can be?
Good question. Well, one very important reform that needs to happen is a very effective pretrial release program where judges, prosecutors, and defense lawyers are given information about the person who's before the court, and that information is shared, and that information is accurate, and that information is reliable, and so the system can make appropriate decisions about who should be, what sort of bail should be set, who should be kept in, and who should be released.
And that should be an independent agency.
Exactly.
But Ali, we've been talking about that in this county for a while. It hasn't happened. Why?
Well, the Supreme Court, the Illinois Supreme Court intervened on the county late last fall and did a thorough review of the pretrial operations here and found that there was a general lack of understanding and respect and efficacy for the pretrial services department that exists here right now. We have a pretrial services department that has to hurriedly do interviews of only a fraction of the jail admissions, the jail admittees, the detainees coming in. And that information is hardly ever verified. It's only done in about a third of the cases. And therefore, the judges never use it. And reforming that is the key issue. In other jurisdictions that are doing it right, those pretrial service officers have the time and the training, and the bond court judges have the training to understand that these are risk assessments. These are judging the public safety and flight risk of an individual coming in, and they're allowed to make specific recommendations as to what pretrial release conditions should be. And those jurisdictions have found that they rely then more on personal recognizance, letting people out on what they call I-bonds without money.
Commissioner, you sit on the Cook County Board. Is the political will there in a time of budget crisis to spend millions of dollars to create an independent pretrial system?
Well, I'm working to make sure that the political will is there. In my view on this has been that the money that we put into that system is not an expenditure, it's an investment that will save us money over time. So we had the Chief Judge, Tim Evans, appear before us a couple weeks ago during our budget hearings. He is committed, and we've given them extra resources for more pretrial hearing officers, extra state's attorneys to work on the pretrial aspects of this. The Chief Judge and representatives, I think, from the state's attorney, the sheriff, public defender, the president's office, were in D.C. to see how this is working in other jurisdictions. The Chief Judge has told us that he is going to be starting a pilot program in Cook County to look at having, first of all, taking these hearings from 30 seconds to maybe 5 minutes, as much of a luxury as that sounds, to make sure that we are analyzing this the right way. And I think people will see that as we put these resources in, we're going to get a dividend back, both in lives that are saved, as well as money that's saved. And that's why this is an issue when you look not just locally, but nationally. You have folks on the left and on the right that are all saying we need to fix bond court. There are very few issues, such as criminal justice reform, where you can bring people together across the spectrum. Because whether you see it as a moral imperative or an economic imperative, people understand that the system right now isn't serving anybody.
What about electronic monitoring? We have so many nonviolent offenders in jail, yet relatively few on a percentage basis are in this electronic monitoring. Does it hold promise, or is it too complicated?
No, I think it does hold promise. I think that there needs to be more people released on electronic monitoring as opposed to less. I mean, there are some technological issues that have to be worked out. Some people, you have to have a phone in your home in order to, there's some technological issues that some poor people are not even eligible for electronic monitoring because of their living circumstances. So that has to be expanded, and I think it will. But any other way that we can get people out with some reporting capability, day centers is another possibility where people are required to come report to a center while they're out and get some training, educational services, vocational services. What we want to do, I think, in our system, and there has to be a cultural change as well, we want to create a system where people who come into the contact with the criminal justice system leave it better off after they're finished than worse off, so that they're not coming back, so that we're reducing our recidivism rate. So whatever ideas that we have to have a long-term objective, and people have to sit down and have the strategic objective. How many people how big do we want our Cook County jail system to be? What is our goal? I mean, do we want to reduce it in half? Those are the things I think that the leaders have to come together, develop some long-term strategic objectives, and then some plans to reach those objectives.
Ali, on the electric monitoring, why hasn't there been more of it? What's the problem?
Well, actually, I don't think that the problem is that there hasn't been enough of it. I think we've actually rushed into expanding the electronic monitoring program rather quickly, and it's produced some unintended consequences. So about a year ago, we had around 7
unintended consequences, meaning people are fleeing or they are leaving their homes?
Well, what's been happening is, so let me just talk about how quickly it's grown. About a year ago, we had 700 to 800 people on electronic monitoring at any given moment. Now we're at 1,800. What that rush into electronic monitoring has done has created issues where people are not being informed exactly about what the rules and boundaries of electronic monitoring are. The Supreme Court report also found that judges were unaware of all the eligibility and requirements of electronic monitoring, and what that results is when people violate, either intentionally by leaving their home and coming back or just stepping out to an area that they didn't know, they get charged with a Class 3 felony escape, because statutorily, violating electronic monitoring is the same as escaping from the jail, which
puts people back.
And not only that, oftentimes these people are on electronic monitoring for lesser charges, misdemeanors and Class 4 felonies, which likely, if they were drug offenses,
and if they violated, they are now escaping from prison.
Right,
in the
exactly.
eyes of the law. We're down to 30 seconds. Commissioner Fritchie, give us your outlook, optimistic, pessimistic, over the next year for the jail here.
If we get the players that have a seat at the table to work together, we know what the solutions are, but we need to take a look at who's getting into the system, whether it's the low-level offenders that shouldn't be there, the mentally ill. We have a big problem. We're the biggest houser of mentally ill individuals in the country. We have folks that should be patients, but we're treating them as inmates. Prognosis is good, though.
On an optimistic note, that wraps up this special presentation, Justice on Trial in Cook County. I'd like to thank our guests, Commissioner John Fritchie, Ali Abid, and Professor Randolph Stone. To hear more of what Cook County Sheriff Tom Dart has to say about the jail, please log on to WYCC.org and In the Loop. I'm Chris Bury.